Hey, this is Elijah with the Oxygen team, and in today's video, we're going to build this cool sticky timeline element that you see here. Note that this is built using only features available in Oxygen with very little, if any, custom code. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive in. The first thing we need to do here, of course, is add a section. And on this section, I'm going to establish a light gray background color so that I can make the timeline entries themselves white. So we'll do this gray color, and I am going to go ahead and save it as a global. And we'll click add there. Now we need 3 columns, so we're just going to use a simple columns element for that. Now let's start by establishing our styles, which means we're going to go ahead and create the elements that we'll be using, but we'll probably completely rearrange them here in a little bit. So first we need a kind of a card element. This is going to be common across all 3 columns. So we'll just add a div and we'll call it timeline card. I'm adding a class here, so we'll click add class, and this class will contain all the common properties for all of these entries. So we'll go ahead and set the width to 100%. But I do want to go ahead and go to advanced size and spacing and set the max width to 600 pixels as well. That becomes important when we switch to our responsive layout for this design. I also want this to be rounded a little bit on the corners, so we'll go to borders and add a little bit of a border radius. Let's do maybe 8 pixels because it's a little bit easier to see in a video, though I probably would do something more like 4 in actual application. But just for actually being able to see what I'm doing here, I'll do 8 pixels. I think that'll look okay. And then under advanced background, of course, we want a white background color. And then back to size and spacing, and we're going to set the padding to 32 pixels. That may end up being a bit much, but we'll see here in a minute. Let's go ahead and drop in a text element. This is going to be our title, and we'll just put a date in, or rather a year. And then let's duplicate that and just drop in some lorem ipsum. So this is what our entries are going to look like. So we want a fairly short bit of text here, and we want our title to be bigger. Now, before I style anything, I'm of course going to add a class. We'll call this timeline entry title. And then this one will be timeline entry description. Now we can go ahead and add some styles to our title here. So we'll change the text color, make sure it's a nice dark color, and then we'll ramp this font size up quite a bit. Now, before we go too much further, I am going to go into my global styles and set my fonts to a font called Fig Tree. We'll drop that in for headings and for our body text as well. All right, so now we have our kind of timeline entry layout. Let's go ahead and adjust the line height on this entry title. So we'll go to typography and find our line height and set it to maybe 1.2 because this is more of a heading. And then we'll add some bottom margin. Actually, no, we won't. We'll use gap instead because that's way smarter to do. So let's select our container here and just add some gap. We'll probably need the same gap across all of these card elements anyway. So let's look at 8 pixels. Let's look at 16. 16 looks pretty good. We can always reduce it later if we need to. So there's our first card. This is actually going to be our timeline entry. And we're going to have entries on the left and on the right. So we'll have one over here, and actually multiples as you scroll down. The other thing I want is like a little caret, I believe they call them, that little triangle piece that sticks out from the side of this to indicate that it's pointing at our little floating card in the middle. So the way we're going to do that is with a new class, and we'll call this timeline entry -- left. And we're going to go ahead and go to advanced layout and set this to position relative. Now we're going to go to states and do an after pseudo element. And we're going to go to advanced layout and absolute. And for the right, we're going to do -16 pixels. And let's go ahead and give this some dimension here. So we'll go to size and spacing and set the width to 32 pixels and the height to 32 pixels. And then of course, we're going to need a background color here. There we go. Now we see our little caret. Of course, it's not correct because it's just a block of color. So 2 things we need to do. We need to round those corners under advanced borders. We're going to go to border radius and we'll use 8 pixels here to kind of match the parent. And then we're going to want to go to advanced effects and we are going to rotate this a bit under transform. We'll add a rotation of 45 degrees. And then because our corner rounding is a little bit aggressive, we might have to adjust that here to only apply to the proper corner of this element. So let's go to the after element and go back to borders. And no, we don't want a dashed border, so I'm going to deselect that. And then we're going to click edit individual radius. And I believe the top right border is the one that we want to have rounded. So we'll unround that one and unround that one, which should give us a better effect. And then just to make sure that that's applied, we'll have 8 pixels on the top right. And then bottom left can be 0 as well. So now we have our caret kind of sticking out, pointing towards the middle column, which is where our little floating element is going to be as we scroll down. Now what we need to do is create a right version of this class. So we'll do that over here, and we'll just add timeline entry right, and then we're going to actually copy all the styles from that other class. So we need to add it to this element as well. So we'll do timeline entry left here. Even though we don't actually need this class here, we do need it temporarily to go ahead and copy the styles over. So now we'll just click our copy button here, and then we'll copy over to that entry right class. Now we can get rid of the left class. And then we can go into our entry right class and make adjustments on that after element. So the first thing we need to do is adjust our position under layout. We want to be -16 on the left instead. And then of course we need to adjust our border. So let's go down here, and now we need our bottom left, I believe, to be 8 pixels, which it looks like it did the trick, and then the rest to be 0. So now depending on which class we apply, we have the little arrow sticking out in the right direction. So I think our timeline entries are ready. Now we just need our little floating card that goes in the middle. So we can just duplicate this, or in fact, we'll copy and paste it over into this middle column. And then we'll get rid of our entry left class, and then we will add a new class, and then we'll just select the ID. Since we're only going to have one of these elements, we can style it on the ID. So we're going to align everything to the center. We'll select our description here, swap to the ID, and make sure that's aligned to the center as well under typography. And then we'll shorten this text to say something like through the years. And what is our title going to be? Maybe accomplishments. Of course, that's way too big, so we'll dial that down a bit. And you can see it's affecting all of the titles because I have that class selected, but I kind of like the smaller size on these titles, so I'm okay with that. Here we've created the basic repeated elements of this design that we're working on. Now we need to add some kind of bespoke stuff to this middle column. And the way we're going to do that is with a before and an after element. We don't need a class here because we only want to do this one time. But we do need to, on this middle column, we need to go to advanced layout and set it to position relative. And then we need to make sure everything's set up with Flexbox to lay things out how we want. So we're going to lay out the child elements vertically and center them all. Now we can go over to our before element first, and we're going to pick a dark color that's not quite desaturated. I'm thinking maybe a dark blue or purple like that. And we'll save that as a global called dark. And we'll probably use that color across our headings as well here, and maybe our text. Here's the nice part. We used a class, so when we change one, it changes all of them. It saves us a ton of work. So we're going back to this middle column, we're clicking the state and going to before. And now we need to create a little kind of dot or circle. So we're going to go to advanced size and spacing, and we're going to set the width and height to 16 pixels. And then we're going to go to advanced borders, and we're going to set the border radius to a huge number like 100%. That gives us our little dot. Then we're going to go to advanced layout and set this to position absolute. And we're going to set this to be at the top of this div, the very top actually, so 0, because we want to see this above our floating card. And now we need to add that kind of dotted dashed line track that goes down behind this floating card. So we're going to use the after pseudo element here. Again, we can go ahead and set it to position absolute, which is what we want, but we're going to set the top and the bottom to 0. Then we're going to go over to primary, and actually let's jump over to advanced size and spacing and set the width to something like 2 pixels. And then now we want to do this border treatment to make it look like a dashed line. So we want to set just our right border to a dashed line, And the color we want is the one that we used everywhere else that's a dark color. And we can set the width to something like 2 pixels. So there we have our little dashed line effect. And no matter how tall this div gets, if we go over here and just play with the height on it, advanced size and spacing, if we set the height to, 1,000 pixels, that line is going to accommodate that, which is what's nice about using the absolute positioning for that element. But we also have an issue here, which is it's above our card. We don't want that, so we'll select the card, and we're going to go to Advanced Layout and raise our Z index, not that button, raise our Z index to something like 10. So now we have the basis of a timeline element. Now what we need to do is add a new div that's going to live in the left and right columns primarily. And this div is going to do nothing other than provide some space. So we'll call it Timeline Spacer. And we're going to go to Advanced Size and Spacing and choose a height for this, maybe 300 pixels. This is going to be the space between timeline elements. So we can copy this element and we're going to paste it over here. And then we'll probably move this timeline entry below that one. So now we get this kind of staggered effect. And you could space them out a little bit more if you want to. So if we duplicate that spacer, now we have a little bit more room to breathe. But we do need to go ahead and match the spacers over here as well. So then we would duplicate this a couple of times, and then we would copy and paste our timeline entry element, which just drops in down here at the bottom. So now we have 3 timeline entries. Now we would copy and paste this element a few times. And we're probably going to do one more entry here at the very bottom. So let's grab this element, copy, and paste it down here at the end. So now you can see this kind of cool staggered timeline effect. But this last entry, we are going to adjust a little bit. So we're not going to use the classes because we want this to be uniquely styled. We're going to set the background color to our dark color. And then we're of course going to need to adjust that before element. So we'll set the background color to dark on that as well. Or actually it may have been the after element. Let's go ahead and check that on the class. Looks like we did use after. That's why that didn't work. So we'll go back over to the ID, go to after, and adjust the background color here. So now we need to go ahead and adjust the color of the text elements within this container. So we'll select those, go to the IDs, and choose our gray color and see how that looks. No, I think I want that to be actually pure white. We'll do the same thing for the description. And again, I'm swapping over to the ID because this is kind of a bespoke design for just this card, and I don't want it to affect all the other ones. Okay, and so now we have a few timeline entries, and as we scroll down, we get to see all of them, eventually ending in this emphasized one here at the end. But I do believe I promised a sticky timeline element, which the sticky portion of this is this middle element here. So the way we're going to accomplish that is very simply, we're going to go to the ID of the element, we're going to go to Advanced Custom CSS and say Position Sticky. Top, 64 pixels. I think that'll do it. Let's collapse that and scroll. And now you can see that this sticks to the top of the window as we scroll down. Now, 64 pixels might be a bit much, so we can drop that down maybe to 32, and that might look a little bit better. There we go. And then we need something to scroll into at the bottom so that we can reach the very bottom of this timeline. So we're going to add another section. And we're going to do something here that I think is kind of interesting. We're going to add another card that kind of exists above the timeline that this timeline element can fade into. And in fact, we may not actually need another section. Let's keep this a little simpler. Let's just add it into this existing section. Let's drop in a div, and let's see if we can go ahead and just reuse our card class. That looks pretty good. And on this section, we're going to want to center everything so that it just lives right there. And then we'll probably want to add a few spacers below this last entry. So let's paste that in, maybe just one spacer for now. We can actually adjust the height of that if we want. So now this is going to have some text in it. So we'll use the same kind of heading text that we were using there and the same description text as well. So we'll just copy and paste those elements over. Now we'll add some more text here. And then this particular instance of this text, I do not want it to be aligned to the middle. Okay, so now we have this final kind of card that we're led into as we scroll down. And then I do end up needing a section below this just because I'm not going to have more content, but I want to be able to scroll down enough for our sticky card to kind of run behind this final element. So I'm just going to add a bunch of top padding to this section, and then we'll set the background color to gray. Now on this element, we want to do something kind of interesting. We're going to choose the ID. We're going to go to advanced size and spacing, and we're going to give it a negative margin of maybe 150 pixels. We want that sticky card to be able to roll behind this final element. So let's back it up a little bit more, maybe negative 200 pixels to give it room to run into there. Okay, that looks pretty good, but now we have some z-index issues. So we want this div that we're working with, this final entry, if you will, to have a pretty high z-index to go above all this other stuff. So we'll go to advanced layout, find z-index, and I think 20 will do it. So now you can see this card, this floating sticky card, goes behind this final entry, which is a nice effect, I think. But I don't want it to just kind of disappear suddenly. I want it to fade out. There are a few different ways you could do this, but the simplest one I thought of was with a box shadow. So we'll go to advanced effects, box shadow, and we're going to set it to black for now, but we'll change that color here in a minute. We're going to set it to 0 pixels horizontal offset and then a negative vertical offset. So something like 64. And then we'll play with the blur here. Essentially, we want the shadow to be pure black by the time it gets to the top of this card, because what we're then going to do is change this color to the same color as the background. And that gives us this fading out effect for our sticky card. Okay, so that's the first little fancy bit of style we want to do. The last one we want to do is to add some animation. So we're going to select this left card, make sure we're on the entry left class, and we're going to go to advanced effects, animate on scroll. We're going to enable the animation and set it to fade right. And we're going to mess with the animation trigger offset here to make sure that it animates when we want it to. So we'll just start with something like 600 pixels. Because we don't want these animating just as soon as they get into the viewport. We actually want them to animate as they kind of coincide with our floating card in the middle. So let's go ahead and apply these settings over here as well, except for we want it to fade into the left. So we'll go to advanced effects, animate on scroll, and do the same thing, except for the animation type is going to be fade left. And then we'll do the animation trigger offset, 600 pixels. Now let's go ahead and test that because it can be a little strange to get it to line up exactly how we want. This first entry, we do expect to just be here since we're at the top of the page, but if we were scrolling down from another section, it would fade in. Now let's see when the entry on the right fades in. That's actually not too bad. I think we can work with that. Now if we keep going, we should see the entry on the left fade in and then the one on the right. So now you're seeing the almost final version of this. But we have a few adjustments to make because this thing is going to be a mess on mobile until we make a few minor changes. So let's jump back into Oxygen and make these final tweaks. First of all, I believe I have way too many spacers on one of these sections. No, that looks okay. But I do want an additional spacer above this first entry to give us a little bit of lead time before it pops in. So we'll just add a spacer up there. And then we're going to add a section above this section to give us, again, some room to scroll. So we'll duplicate that section and move it on up. Perfect. So now we can scroll and see the effect efficiently. And in fact, I do see too many spacers here. So let's get rid of this one and this one and this one and see where that puts us. I think we want to go back up even one more maybe. And that's the nice thing is you can space these out pretty much however you want. If you want more space between, you can add more spacers. Otherwise, you can kind of condense things down. I think that looks okay. Now it's time for our mobile changes. So this really is not too much work to make mobile responsive. Let's go ahead and save before we jump in, and let's go ahead and look at our columns element. It's going to stack vertically at less than 992 pixels. So that's where we want to start our work, because it's all going to look fine at this viewport, and then less than 992, we're going to end up with some strangeness. So the first thing I want to do is set this columns element to advanced layout position relative. Then I'm going to go ahead and choose the middle column, which is where our floating card lives. And we're going to set it to, under advanced layout, we're going to do position absolute, and we're going to do a 0 on top, left, right, and bottom, which will get us the element kind of stretched out over everything else. And you can see now we already have like a pretty okay effect. We need to adjust the order of these entries and their Z index and things like that. So we'll choose these divs here, these column divs, and just raise their Z index a little bit. We'll do something like, I think 15 would put them kind of where we want them to be, because we want them to be over our floating card. Yep, that works. And then we'll do the same thing on the right-hand side. Advanced layout, Z index of 15. Now our floating card is kind of going behind all of these elements, which is what we want. But I also want to kind of center these things within their respective column divs. So we're going to go to advanced layout and make sure everything is centered on both of these column divs. So we'll go to the left one now, advanced layout, and center. And for our entries, we also want to hide these little arrow elements that we have. So we'll go to timeline entry left, we'll go to state after, and go to advanced layout, display none. And we'll do the same thing on the entries for the other side. So we're selecting this, making sure we're on the class timeline entry right. We're going to go to state after, advanced layout, display none. All right, so now we have essentially a pretty solid layout for mobile, but we have too much space between these elements, so we can actually go to advanced layout, display none on some of these spacers to reduce that. So we'll just put 2 between each. And if we scroll on up, we can see that we now basically have the layout that we would like. So let's preview on the front end and make sure everything is moving in the right direction. And then we have one final, somewhat difficult challenge to overcome. So let's inspect and drop this down to a mobile screen size. And here you can see that it switched over to that full width. And as we scroll down, we're going to see those timeline entries come in. And if we keep going, we get the other one from the left, and then we start getting our right side entries. Now we might want to adjust the offset for the animation on mobile, but in fact, it's probably better to just disable animations on mobile. So we're going to go ahead and do that. We'll go to our global settings and do that there. Under global styles, animation on scroll, we will say disable on less than 992 pixels. And then if we refresh and scroll down, we'll see our layout without any animations, which I think is probably preferable given you don't want a mobile user scrolling a bunch of empty space, not sure what's coming next. You want them to be able to see what they're scrolling to. So in this case, that works out just perfectly. Now the challenge we have is the fact that our timeline entries on desktop are in a different order. Well, that's pretty easy to overcome, though it's a little bit more manual than I would like. Basically, we can add a class to our entries that tells us that these are for desktops. And then we can add some separate ones for mobile that are in a different order. So just so that we can see what we're doing, let's go ahead and change the year on these to be sequential so that I can see what order they're actually in. And this last one will be 1993. Now, if we go down here, you can see that we get 1990, 1992, 1991, 1993, which is not the order we want them in. So let's go up here and let's make some duplicates. And at less than 992 pixels, we will set this to advanced layout display none. But let's go back up here because we need it again for the mobile view. Now, this one in particular is probably going to be fine because it's the first entry, but we're going to go ahead and establish our logic and styles on it, and then we'll apply it where we need it. So now we're going to add a timeline entry mobile class. And this one will be hidden at advanced layout, display none. It'll be hidden at desktop, but become visible at less than 992 pixels. So now we have our classes set up. We can actually go ahead and remove them from this element because this element is the one that we don't need to make an adjustment for. And now what we need is we need to determine which ones are out of order and which ones we need to adjust. So let's go down here. We have 1990, 1992. So we need a 1991 there in the middle somewhere, which is easy to do. So we'll go ahead and find 91. We'll copy. We'll go over here and paste it into this. And then we'll put it where we want it within this div. We'll probably put it between a couple of these spacers. And it's invisible because it hasn't animated in yet. Now that we have that there, we can apply the mobile class to this. So we'll do timeline entry mobile. Now that will hide it on desktops, but if we go down to less than 992 pixels, we're going to see we go from 1990 to 91 to 92. Now we need to apply the same logic over here, but we need to hide the 91 on mobile. So we'll just designate this as a desktop entry. We'll do desktop and drop that in, which will hide it on our mobile. So now when we go down here, we don't see any duplicates. We'll see 90, 91, 92, and then it'll skip on down to 93. Now, the last thing we need to do here on mobile is we need to hide some of these spacers. So you can see we have one between each of these up here. So we need to hide a bunch of these. So we'll go to Advanced Layout, None, Advanced Layout, None. We could use a class to do this as well. Advanced Layout, None. In fact, we could have used the desktop class to do that and save a bunch of time, but I didn't think about it until I was already done, so we'll stick with that. So now if we look at the order of these on mobile, we have 90, 91, which won't be animated on the front end, 92, and 93, and then to our final one. So let's go up to the front end and see what this looks like. We'll refresh and start scrolling. Accomplishments through the years, 1990, we did something, 1991, 92, 93, our final one. And then our floating card fades out behind this final bit of content. And then on desktop, here's what it looks like. Scroll on up. We're starting out from the very top as if we just visited the website for the first time. And we're going to scroll down. We encounter this timeline element. As we begin scrolling, the middle card sticks with us and the other entries start animating in a staggered order from left to right, until we reach the final one and our floating card fades away. So I think that about covers this sticky timeline element. Even if you don't need this particular element, I have noted that this kind of sticky effect where you have one element that kind of follows along as you scroll down the page is becoming more and more common in web design. So hopefully there will be some techniques here that you'll be able to apply to whatever you're working on, even if it's not a timeline. Again, this is Elijah with the Oxygen team, and thank you very much for watching.